Am I the only one that absolutely adores autumn? Just everything about the aesthetic. Oh my gosh. Quick minute to talk to you guys about my perspective of the psyche, my perspective of the soul. And although it may differ from the opinions of other teachers, I really have a solid perspective of this and a solid opinion and approach to this. Okay, there are some people who would perceive the ego and the personality or the persona as aspects of the self or of the person as a whole that are to be discarded from lifetime to lifetime and seen as separate from the soul. But I want to share why I disagree with that. Now, when we're talking about the core of the soul, we're talking about the inner child. That is the light. That is the purest form of your soul. Okay, that is the purest aspect of your soul. So when we're talking about that, and we're talking about the 257 sequence that I've coined, talking specifically about wounding to that aspect of the soul and the different aspects of the psyche and different correlations between that aspect and others that cause contradictory or abusive or addictive behavior, right? That's what we're talking about. So we're talking about that purest aspect of the soul being the inner child. And when that aspect is wounded, it casts a shadow, which leads to different forms of behavior. Now, let me give you an example, right? When I talk about the shadow being cast by the inner child, this is what I mean. Let's say we're talking about an inadequacy wound. This is very common for most human beings, but it's especially prevalent amongst, let's say, narcissists. But let's be more specific. Let's talk about vulnerable narcissists because they're more verbal about it, right? They're more verbal about their judgments and they're more verbal about their critiques of themselves, right? And their critiques of, like, it's very blatant. It's very obvious with them. That's why I'm using them as an example. So what happens is those critiques that they feel internally become external. That is energetic exchange. That is the hallmark of the shadow. And that is a shadow that is being cast by the inner child wound. So then when we get into what the ego actually represents, we're talking about the microchip of the soul. So the ego, a lot of people think, oh, you have a big ego, this and that. Okay, yeah, we're talking about that. That's correct. Okay, so to speak. If you have a big ego or if you have a very reactive ego and things like that, the concept works, right? But what the ego actually is and why it would be so big or inflated or reactive is because of the amount of wounding it holds, the amount of memory of wounding that it holds, which makes it so reactive or makes it so inflated because it's serving to attempt to protect the inner child, just like the shadow serves to protect the inner child, okay, through energetic transference, okay? And that is exactly why the ego is a part of the soul. And that is why the ego is an aspect of the psyche that continues from lifetime to lifetime, because it is in fact the part of the soul that remembers all of these things that have happened to us. It's the microchip. And when we're talking about the persona, just as when we talk about the inner child casting the shadow, those are polarities. When we're talking about the persona, we're talking about the polarity of the ego. So our persona or our personality tends to be the result of various things that have been programmed. That is also an aspect of the ego that it needs to be understood and discussed. It is the microchip that holds the traumas, but it is also the microchip that is programmed by a variety of different factors. Our experiences, our societies, what we're taught, what we're shown, what we see, what we hear. Okay, so this is also something that travels from lifetime to lifetime. So it does influence our persona. So in total here, we are talking about this all being varying components of the soul. And these do continue with you from lifetime to lifetime.